I've received some requests to do some videos about calculus, and I do plan to do a whole bunch of videos on calculus. And again, this is a pretty new account, but I thought it might be helpful to do a very simplistic introduction to calculus. In fact, maybe a little bit overly simplistic, but it might give you an idea of why calculus is so useful and why all the things that you've been doing in mathematics up until now really is leading up to what you'll be doing in calculus. So just as an introduction, calculus deals with lines and graphs that are not quite so kind to us. If we were to look for the slope of a straight line, that's very easy to calculate. But the problem is life tends to not be in straight lines. And so, for example, if I'm working in business and I've got this graph and I'm trying to figure out, why are things turning around in my business right here and how quickly are things declining? And maybe I want to figure out at this point right here, how quickly is my business declining right here? Now, to find that, we would need to know the slope of this tangent line, and that's not very easy to calculate. And so what calculus does, or at least where it originated from, is calculus says, well, what if we take a look at 2 points that are equal distance from here on our graph, and if we can calculate the slope of that line, that'll give us an approximation. Now, obviously, that we don't know exactly how close that approximation is, but what happens if we were to take the line and make the line a little bit shorter and use 2 points closer to our point? And what if we took 2 points even closer and went even a little bit closer? In fact, what calculus does is it says, well, let's take the limit as the width of that line approaches zero. And so what it does is it's taking a whole bunch of calculations and saying, what's happening to that line? What does the slope of that look like as we get closer and closer to the point that we're trying to evaluate? And calculus allows us to make that calculation really pretty simply. Another thing that it does, let's say we're trying to find the area underneath this curve between these 2 points. Now, if this were a rectangle, it's pretty easy to find the area of a rectangle. And so what calculus does is it says, well, let's line up this right side with a point on the graph, and we'll just create a rectangle, and that'll give us an estimation. And obviously that's a terrible estimation because we're adding a little bit here and we're leaving out a whole bunch up here. And so what we do, again, well, let's break it down into 2 boxes. Well, now we've got a little bit added out here, but we're missing stuff here, and so that begins to make up the difference. And again, what calculus does is it says, well, let's make more boxes. And eventually, all we're doing is we're taking the limit as the width of these boxes approach zero. As we're creating more and more boxes, we're going to get closer and closer to the approximation of the area underneath that curve. Well, calculus allows us to make a whole bunch of calculations using very simple calculations. It allows us to solve the problems, in fact, without having to make all those individual calculations, simply because some amazing patterns begin to show up that are now applicable over all sorts of different curves that make the calculations very, very easy. Now, the problem is it also causes some issues with mathematicians. In fact, I remember the first time I took calculus, I got very lost at first because all of a sudden we began to talk a different language. And it took me a while to figure out exactly what we were talking about. And so the quicker that you can catch on to the language that's being spoken, things begin to simplify. But all we're doing is we're using limits, at least we're beginning to use limits to come up with approximations that actually, using calculus, become exact. It's an extremely useful thing, very useful in normal life. Engineering uses different forms of calculus all the time, but calculus makes the world go round.